Hello, good evening, and welcome in the third evening of the November Talks lecture series this year. I would like to firstly thank to the Stowe Foundation for the support of this lecture series and also the Faculty of Architecture. Today we will have our guest Bernadette Krejs from Vienna, I'm really happy that you joined us today. After the two first lectures, after the lecture about the housing models and the housing references, and the last week excursion to London with Astrid Smitham. Today we will focus on the situation and in Vienna, which is extraordinary model also in a housing politics, we will I'm really happy that we have Bernadette here to shared her point of view to the city together with us. So Bernadette is a researcher, senior researcher on the Technical University in Vienna, she also is a curator and author of publications. Yes, thank you for coming, and I'm happy to have you here, and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here in Prague and to be part of these serious November talks. And thank you, Miroslav, for creating this wonderful program and also putting the question of housing into the spotlight. I think it's one of the most urgent and relevant topics we are facing today when we're dealing with spatial practices. My lecture has the title Housing Otherwise, Practicing of Care in Vienna's Housing Model. And as Miroslav already said, I'm from Vienna, the so-called city of good, affordable housing. I'm based there at the Department of Housing and Design at the Technical University in Vienna. And I'm very much interested in the question, how do we live together on this planet from a planetary scale with non-human actors, the environment, to the scale of the city, the neighborhood, our apartments, but also how power relation and gender roles are performed in kitchens and bedrooms, etc. I'm not a practicing architect, so you won't see any buildings that I build. I'm in academia since more than 10 years. And what I want to try in this lecture is to add to an architectural approach to housing the aspect of spatial, economic, and social justice. I will look at actors, relations, spaces, and buildings which are already here. So we will go back into history, but also try to look a bit forward what maybe might be, and try to understand the entanglements, consequences, but also possibilities for a more just and caring and better living for all of us. When it comes to housing, the housing crisis does not affect everybody equally, and I think it's important to recognize that there are intersectional inequalities, especially when it comes to women or gender diverse people. And I think we can learn a lot here from feminist spatial practices, where the relationship between space and care is a central component. So in this lecture, I will also try a bit to address the different notions of care. We will look at care work at our homes, the so-called housework, but also the worries and anxieties about our homes, and that's maybe, let's call it the so-called housing crisis. I think it's also important these are some publications I did. I wanted to show that why I'm not showing buildings, because we tried at our department to look at things and try to write that down in certain books. What is also important for me is that we have to hold space where we can discuss topics of the home, of care, of community. Because we all want to be held in safety and in safe homes and out of harm. and to hold space for care, connectedness, and hope. And the images you can see here are part of an exhibition I co-curated with Max Utech at the German Architecture Center called Palace of Unlearning. And in some way, we tried also to hold space there to debate what it means to unlearn established norms of dwelling or being together on this planet, and how we could move forward to an architecture of multiplicity, empathy, solidarity, and circularity, terms which are maybe not very often part of the architectural canon. And I think we need spaces where we can debate these things in exhibition spaces, but also when it comes to housing, in shared spaces, in community spaces, to hold spaces for each other. With that, I want to show you a bit what I want to speak about today. So I made 3 chapters. The first one is why housing otherwise. It's a bit that we are all facing a global housing crisis. In the second chapter, I want to try to address how to do housing otherwise and show some practices of care. And in the last chapter, I would suggest what are we doing when we imagining housing otherwise for a more just, caring future. So it's a bit, what could a future be if it's more caring? So when we jump directly to the first chapter, I want to ask you the question, what is a home? And I think housing or a home means many things to different groups. So a home is a home for residents, but it's also a site for reproduction, and that means labor. It means work for those who construct, manage, and maintain a home. It is the largest economic burden for many of us. For others, it's a source of wealth, status, profit, and control. It's a speculative profit for those buying and selling it. And David Madden and Peter Marcuse wrote in defense of housing that housing is more as a shelter, and that it's of course a site of oppression and injustice, but it's also a space where cultural identity, individuality, and creative powers can emerge. So again, it's a very diverse and complex space. And another explanation what a home could be is very beautifully described in the text of Bell Hooks, and this is a spatial installation by Matri Architecture in relation to this text of Bell Hooks. It's called Home Place, a site of resistance, and Bell Hooks is more or less saying that the home has a political dimension, and one's home place was the one site where one could freely confront the issues of humanization, where one could resist home place, a site of resistance. And I think very often we are talking about the home, the private sphere, as something boring or unpolitical, not political, and the public space and the city are the interesting sites. And I think I really recommend reading this text of Bell Hooks, where she describes it, especially for marginalized groups. The home place can also be the site of resistance where community can grow. So I think what we can agree on all is that home is more than just a physical space. And this leads me to the second fact, that housing is under attack. We are facing a global housing crisis. And when we look at this report of the United Nations, we can see that 2.8 billion people worldwide lack access to adequate housing. And these are 30% of the global population. So that's quite a big number, I would say. I think this is not just a problem of housing shortage, it's also a problem of housing mismatch. And this is an image from Vienna where you see in the back the Triple, which is a luxury housing project. And in the foreground, you can see some huts from the so-called settler movement, remaining huts. So there are different reasons why we are facing a global housing crisis. One reason is the financialization of housing. You all know housing is also seen as a capital, as an investment. We all know the terms of gentrification, short-time rentals, etc., etc. Another reason are increasing prices, and we should all not pay more than 30% of our household income should be spent on housing, and the numbers are quite higher than that. Of course, the climate crisis or the climate catastrophe, then also demographic changes, vacant homes. So there is not always the problem that we have too less homes, that they are in some way mismatched or not used on the wrong location. And also that soil or land is increasing in terms of costs. So one could say there is a kind of a conflict between housing as a lived space or a social space and housing as an instrument of profit making. So maybe the difference between housing as a home or housing as a real estate. And we should have always in mind that housing is a human right, like you can read it here, and it's also part of the UN Declaration, where really the word housing is part of the declaration next to food, medical care, and other things. This brings me to the idea that housing could be a social infrastructure. And I would like to combine the idea of housing as a social infrastructure to the time of Red Vienna. And the term of social infrastructure is borrowed by André Holm. He introduces housing as a social infrastructure financed by public investment, largely free, and intended for all population groups. So we could think of housing as something like libraries, schools, or other public forms of infrastructure, that housing is in some way provided by a welfare state, let's say. And this concept is not so awkward or far away. There have been historical examples which lead in this direction of housing like a social infrastructure. And for example, I would like to point out the time of Red Vienna, but also you had the lecture from the UK and from Sweden. They also had council housing systems which were a bit like where, they sold their stock like a kind of social infrastructure. I don't know how familiar you are with the period of Red Vienna. It's between the two world wars, between 1913 and 1934. And at that time, the city of Vienna spent more than 60% of the total expenses on social infrastructure. And that's quite a high number. So they built, like shown and very good advertised in this poster, a lot of buildings, more than 70,000 apartments, plus a housing extra infrastructure like kindergarten, schools, laundries, etc. They built this kind of housing blocks all over the city, and all the colorful dots are this kind of super blocks and social housing structures. So it was not just on the outskirts, you can find these structures everywhere in the city. And we tried to update this map for an issue of Ach Plus we made 2 years ago, and you can see the different time periods and where these kind of super blocks or social infrastructures were built. They also did something like redistribution. They invented a housing tax, the so-called Breitner-Steuer. You can see this guy here you can see this poster here. And it's more or less that this was a kind of a luxury tax, that they took the money from the rich and invested it in housing. And as you can see on the other image, they were very proud of this kind of redistribution and painted it on every of these social housing structures, saying this building was erected within the money from the housing tax. Think of that today, that the government is proud of redistribution. We have these discussions again, but if you take this word in a room, people, I think, but there are examples that these things have been possible. There was also something like a Housing Requirement Act, which was something like an expropriation of vacant living spaces. So if you didn't use your living spaces, the city took it more or less, and in this case of this act, they built 60,000 new apartments as well. So I think there are a lot of topics, and I'm not going into detail with that, which are which we're discussing today again. So I think it's not so unimaginable to think housing like a social infrastructure. To go to Vienna today, the situation is like that about 50% of all apartments in Vienna are social housing. I mean, there are different segments of it, but I won't go into detail. But these 15% are more or less operated by the city. Then there is the private market, which is like in every other European growing city, very high rents, very high prices. What is really very interesting is that the city of Vienna is, one could say, the largest landlord in Europe. They are managing nearly 500,000 of apartments in Vienna. Vienna is a renter city still, so 77% of people in Vienna are renting. And if you have a contrast in this 55% sector, you have a permanent contract, you have regulated rents, which are between 7 and 9 euros per square meter, which are quite low. The quality of social, you can see here the numbers, just so the costs of excessive housing costs in Vienna are quite low with this 18%. When you look at London, it's 60% or Berlin 50%. So regulated rents are really changing the living conditions of dwellers. Also, the quality of social housing is quite high in Vienna. This is Gleis 21. It's a neighborhood project. It's a subsidized housing project. And Vienna implemented a special form of competition where architecture or social and ecological sustainability is quite high. So there was some research done that the quality of social housing in terms of architecture, floor plans, etc., is much higher than in private built projects. So one could think, and maybe a last point which is super important to mention, Vienna never give up the non-profit system. It's called in German die Gemeinnützigkeit. That means that developers have to deal with a legal framework that they are not allowed to make profit. If they make profit, they have to invest it in new social housing or maintaining it. So that's very short description of it, but that's a very fundamental thing which was, for example, changed in the UK and in Sweden. So one could think that's a paradise there. And I want to say there are many things which are great, and maybe we should keep on what Red Vienna did 100 years ago. But there are also some problems, and I won't go into detail, but the city has still struggles change with climate change. How can we retrofit this old stock in terms of climate questions? In terms of migration, the system has still some racist elements implemented. It's also very normative in kinds of foreplanning, and the Vienna model is a very paternalistic system. I would say it's very drop-down and very organized by the city. But let's stay with that when we are asking why housing otherwise. I think that could be really an answer also to think again as housing as a social infrastructure. I also want to introduce the settlers movement in Vienna. I think this is also a very interesting period in Vienna, and it's also very much connected to these questions. How do we want to live? The settlers movement was a kind of informal urbanization after the Second World War. And what you can see here are these so-called wooden huts, which have been erected on illegal land. Because the situation after the First World War in Vienna was that there was a massive housing crisis. The city was more or less owned by private property owners. There was a lot of migration, a lot of people coming from Vienna. It was the capital of this big Hungarian-Austrian Empire. And about 2 million people lived there. We reached this number some years ago again. So there was a lot of pressure on the housing market, and these private investors were not interested in maintaining because the tenants didn't have enough money. So there was a massive housing shortage, enormous overcrowding. There were these so-called bed goers where you really just rented a bed for the hours where you not have been working in the factory. There was a big homelessness and poor housing quality. And out of that situation, because the city didn't take care of their inhabitants, these kind of settler movements started in Vienna. So there were these kind of illegal occupations where the people in self-help more or less erected these wooden huts. And this was a very special moment in Vienna because we do not have any squatting movements, or as I said, it's a very paternalistic system, a drop-down system, so that people are doing something out of self-organized is something very special. So the settler movement is really an exception in Viennese history. And so for the city, they started to control this kind of settler activities, because they saw also that this was quite a politically relevant mass. And this was a process which very often started in Vienna when something different started. The city then later occupied it and organized it, which is on the one hand great, but on the other hand, also these kind of self-initiated things are in some way dying. So what they did, they bought land and also financed the building process. And you can see here one of the most famous settler buildings. It's called Siedlung Rosenhügel. And what you can see on this image is that it was mostly built by women. There were hardly any machines or materials after the First World War. So it was really handmade by the people there. they have been very small apartments, 2-story apartments, 60 square meters, also always a garden and stables for small animals, so that you can grow your own food. And what the people who have been part of this community had to do, they had to invest 2,000 hours of labor, and they called that a kind of muscle mortgage. And after the building process, the houses were allocated by a lottery after the completion. So it was not clear who will get which apartment. It was really a process of solidarity building these homes, and then everybody got one of it. So this was out of a tremendously big crisis, but it shows that you can also react in a crisis maybe differently. And it was a lot about community, solidarity, care, and self-building. Vienna, or Red Vienna, then later switched to the big housing blocks, and I think you're all familiar with Karl Marxhof, so they built these super blocks, because this was also more controlled than these so-called wild settlers. I also want to mention, when we speak about Red Vienna, Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky. She was one of the first women studying architecture in Vienna. And I think in her sense, the term of social architecture was very important. I think for Schütte-Lihotzky, it was always an aim to improve people's life and dealing with extremely limited financial resources. And she also said her attempt is to provide, let's call it, warmed rooms for Vienna, and I think this resonates a lot with today's crisis as well. I want to introduce 2 projects of her, or 2 concepts, more or less. The one is the so-called settler hut, or the core house. It was also created from her during the so-called settlers movement, what we discussed before, and she observed that many of these settlers did not have time to build their house, so she developed a house which could expand in stages, like you could see here. You started with the ground floor, then it can expand in the 2nd floor, and then adapt it to let's say, a main house. Also here in this project, it was a lot about the idea of self-building, self-help, and cooperative work. And what was also part of this settler hut was, again, a kitchen she developed, or it was far before the Frankfurter Küche. This kitchen was a serious production, and it was more or less really the most important part of the building. And she says, first the core, then the facade, not the other way around. And when you see the floor plan here, it's really a lot about this kitchen, and a not separated kitchen, a kitchen in the living room where you could live together. So it was not so much about making housework more effective. It was in that case really also to create a kind of community. So in these projects, the kitchen, but also the house, was a kind of a standardized construction, also to reduce costs. Another idea of her was that she was always very much interested in special marginalized groups, people who do not have a lot of money, or in that case also the needs of women. She says, we architects therefore have a damn duty and obligation to rack our brains about what needs to be done in housing to make life easier for women and men. And she developed this apartment for single working women, and like with many concepts of Schütte-Lihotzky, it was they stayed concepts, so not all of them could be implemented were. The idea was really to think of the need of working women. This was very much inspired by the Housing for the Minimal Substance Level, introduced at the SIAM Congress in 1929. So there was the idea of the small apartments. After the Second World War, there were a lot of women, they were working, and they had really hard access to the housing market. They had lower salaries. So she was really interested in creating a living space for this very special kind of group. The idea was not to do something like a boarding house. The idea was to integrate these apartments into existing social housing block or municipal housing. And she developed different kinds of apartment, and you can see the different types here, and the apartment types were depending on the income of the working woman. And I think there's one problem, one could say, by designing the apartment types according to the income group, she inconsequently translated the inequality of the starting conditions into unequal living space unequal living sizes. So I think it was a kind of a reality that there were different jobs for women and different amount of money you could spend, but I think maybe that's also a point of critique that we should maybe not reproduce this kind of unfairness. I think there are a lot of things we can learn from Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky to do housing otherwise, especially these are topics which are very important nowadays as well. The material, so she had an early critique of normative housing models, developing especially housing plans for women or for non-nuclear families. And I think she reflected also very wisely on the question of labor, resources and material shortages. And I think these are all topics which are very relevant today as well. So I think maybe this was a bit of an introduction why we have to think housing otherwise and which kind of strategies already existed in doing housing otherwise. And the question is a bit how to do that now. And the question, I want to introduce some concepts of care, and also the term of social reproduction is maybe important in that sense. And then want to introduce here Joan Tronto, which did a lot of great writing about care, and she says care is also connected to maintain, to continue and to repair, and that this world includes our bodies, ourselves and our environments. And the question is, why care in architecture, or why is it important to introduce of care also to spatial questions? And in that case, I think it's very important to have in mind that architecture is in the need of care. It is dependent on maintaining, cleaning and daily upkeeping to sustain its existence. And Elke Krasny wrote a lot about care as well in relation to space. And she says, when we talk about feminist spatial practices, and we can say, when we talk about space or housing, we are essentially talking about existential dimensions of space that must be cared for so that people can care for themselves and others. So it's important that we care for our homes, that we care for our buildings, so that we can care for each other. In architecture, we are not very used to the idea to care. The idea of the architecture, of the architect, I would say historically, is linked to autonomy and to the independent genius rather than caregiving. So this clearly positioned the architect outside of care. And I think especially when it comes to the climate catastrophe, it's important to put ourselves as architects again to the word of care and to the practices of care. Care is needed for survival of an exhausted planet, and the lack of concerns for space has existential life-changing consequences, as we can see living on a broken planet. Care also means work, and home is a site of labor. We do cooking, cleaning, child caring, emotional care, maintaining here. The home is a strategic site where social reproductive labor is happening, and Silvia Frederici wrote a lot about these kind of forms of labor, and she says the reproduction of labor power has been mystified and made invisible, even though it is the foundation of capitalist accumulation. So capitalism could not exist without the constant work of maintaining workers and space, and much of this happens at home unwaged. Without this labor of caring and maintaining, no economic formation could last. So the crisis of social reproduction and the politics of care are inseparably linked to housing. When housing is overcrowded, poorly maintained or otherwise inadequate, social reproductive processes are put under pressure. Care requires space. Every time a public housing is demolished or a household is evicted, some pieces of care infrastructure is destroyed. So I think that's very important, that it's caring about material, but it's also caring for each other. And a structure like this, when we destroy it, we also destroy in some way the care structures which connect us. So I think I would argue it's important that we have to work towards an architecture of care again. And Frederici also argues that collective forms of reproduction and practice of community can enable our independence. And I think that's in some way also a form of resistance to do this care work together and not individualized. this was a lot, but there are some examples how this kind of care work was implemented in housing structures. And one example I would like to show is an experiment on care, the one kitchen house. The one kitchen houses you can find all over Europe, and 2 of them are also in Vienna. The one kitchen house concept was developed I think 1900 by a German woman rights activist and social democrat Lily Braun. The aim was liberating working women from the multiple burdens of housework, and in 1909, Augustin Ficker, she was an Austrian social reformer, was founded the so-called Heimhof. And this is a map which shows some of the experiments in housing. We have always these kind of projects which, I don't know, in some way skip the canon and try something else out. In Vienna, the one kitchen house, and you can find it here very much on the beginning. I have to point here. Was one of these experiments and was also not copied again. So Augustin Ficker founded this Heimhof, which was a housing cooperative, and there were 2 buildings in Vienna. This is one of these buildings. One was for single women and the other one was for working couples and families. That's this one here. And I think the interesting thing with the Ein-Küchenhaus or the Heimhof was that it was a multi-story apartment that you can see here. But the exception was that it was without cooking facilities or very limited for cooking facilities, and that it had a central kitchen. And you can see it here in the basement. There was the central kitchen. There was also a dining room, and then you had an elevator up in your apartment, which was very small, where the food could be, let's say, shipped into your apartment. So this was very revolutionary, to not have a kitchen in your apartment. And it was also a kind of an experiment. And as you can see here, there was not also that the kitchen and the eating was organized differently. There was also a library, a terrace on the top. There was a laundry room, etc., etc. So it was on the one hand the desire of rationalizing living apartments, and I think there was this kind of potential of collectivity. And that women could also organize themselves. You can see here how the food was delivered into the apartment. You can see here that still work was done, or reproductive labor was done by women, but in the end they were paid women here. You can see here the dining room, so you could eat here or upstairs in your tiny apartment, and you could see here that's a staged collage of the terrace, but this was also a space of gathering. And as you could see here, that's the original picture, these 2 women here chatting here, and I would say it was also the possibility that women could organize themselves or do something else than do productive labor. And that's maybe also a reason why this project was not successful or copied again, because it was the potential to organize yourself or to think about other forms of living. In some way, this project, as I said, failed. What it really did not manage was to overcome class relations. Only very well or middle class women could afford to live there, because you have this kind of serviced apartments. And as we already said, the housework was still done by women, let's say less privileged women. Also, the city of Red Vienna in some way rejected the one kitchen house. It was too radical not to have a kitchen. And they also said that the emotional bonds with the family would be destroyed if women are not taking care of food preparation and housework. So I think it's important that projects like this existed, and that you can see that it's possible to organize our care work differently, even if it had some failures or some problematic aspects as well. But I think it's very important to see that you can try out things differently, even more than 100 years ago. In the end, the Küchenhaus was again taken over by the city of Vienna, because they had financing project. They made from these 25 apartments 200 apartments with a very small kitchenette. And then during National Socialism, all of the community spaces were also closed. So today, when you're visiting this block, it's a very normal housing block, and you can't see these traces of liberation anymore. Another project, and I won't go into detail, going on in history was Frauenwerkstatt Rosa und Türkis-Rosa Lila Villa. Frauenwerkstatt was one of the first projects developed by the Women's Office of the City of Vienna. It was so-called woman-friendly, initiated, designed and planned by women. It's very second-wave feminism, a concept of a very binary system, what a man and women is, but very important for the city of Vienna. This is from the project Rosa in Wien-Donaustadt, and this project was also designed in a cooperative process with women. And what is really extraordinary, that all the contracts were just exclusively done with women. And as you can see here on the top floor, so the best address of the building, it's a long block, was the laundry installed. There are not very beautiful photos of this project because they had other aims. It was not about creating fancy architecture. It was really about the role of women in a planning process. And when we go one step further, let's say to third wave feminism, where we see this kind of separation between a woman more diverse, I would like to introduce this project. It's the Türkis-Rosa Lila Villa. It's a self-administrated queer housing project and community center in Vienna. It was founded in 1981, embedded in an emerging gay and lesbian movement in Vienna. It was also part of the squatting scene in Vienna, one of the few squatted projects of Vienna. It was a vacant building which was occupied by these movements, and later they got a contract by the city of Vienna. They renovated it, and today it has some apartments, a community cafe, and a counseling center. And it's for Vienna really a very famous building, important to address for queer Vienna. And many different actors and activist groups are here, queer-based, and also a housing association. So in some way, for the villa, overcoming the heteronormative model of living in the nuclear family is closely connected to political work, reaching beyond the domestic realm. So it's not just housing, it's much more. It's the counseling, it's the activism, etc. I would like to close this chapter with a current project which is very dear to me. It's called Planet Scene, and I call it Caring for the Unknown. Planet Scene is this building. It's the basement, which is currently looks like that. It's a queer migrant, anti-racist, self-organized housing project in Vienna's 10th district. Its mission is to redistribute privilege, provide affordable housing, and create safe, supportive space for people who have fled, immigrated, or newly arrived in Vienna. And this is a group which is really facing structural racism and discrimination, and they are not able to enter the current social housing system. So Planet Scene is really reaching out to a group where everybody forget that this group is also existing. They were founded in 2009, run by non-profit cultural association. Many other activist groups are part of it, like Afro Rainbow Austria. And what is really interesting is that the people who are involved in this project, you could call them a kind of a building group, like in other cooperative projects, but they are not building for themselves. They are building for people who will arrive, who are at the moment not here, but they will for sure come. And I think that's really a very extraordinary idea. You know, we know many of these building group projects of fancy groups, academics who can do this kind of projects. And this is really a group which is planning for people who will arrive. Currently, they are having 8 people can live there, and they are planning more stories, and you can donate to these projects, and Gabo Handel Architektur is doing these additional floors. Why I'm showing this project is not only because of the interesting idea what planning in a group could be, it's also the financing system of this project. We saw at the beginning the basement, the pink plot, which is already here, and they have different forms of financing. Direct loans, they have a mural from a very famous artist which studied in Vienna, had now an exhibition at Albertina, and this mural has quite a value. They have subsidized from the city of Vienna's donation, so these 8 floors will be paid with is a donation from former Nazi money, and they are also part of Habitat, which is the Austrian version of Mietshäuser-Syndikat, and that's more or less that you take a building from the market and it can't be given back, so it can't never be an investment. And they have this kind of microloans, how you can do donations. And I think this is really, in terms also what means housing otherwise, in terms of financing, a really clever and other project how to do architecture or housing otherwise. I'm speaking very long now, and this is the last and very short chapter. It's called Imagining Housing Otherwise for a More Just Caring Future, and it's maybe a bit in which direction could we go? The big question is, can we imagine otherwise? Can we imagine other forms of doing housing? I mean, I was speaking about other formats of financing, other formats of collectivity, what a building group is, etc., about squatting, taking land, etc., but it's very hard for us to imagine how housing could be organized otherwise. We were reading with our students Lola Olufemi, a very book I would recommend, Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, and she says, I quote her here, "The otherwise requires a commitment to not knowing. Are you ready for that?" And I think in architecture we are a very solution-based profession where we want to solve problems with building solutions. And imagining also means not knowing or engaging with the not knowing. I also want to mention Ruha Benjamin in her Imagination, a Manifesto, where she says, we should take imagination seriously. It can reshape our future. So when we can think about things otherwise, it can also change our future. It's a very powerful tool. We should do that collectively, and imagination can craft new stories that reflect our interconnections and offering creative approaches to seemingly untraceable problems. And an untraceable problem is the global housing crisis when we look at the numbers of 40% people facing this crisis. And I think to imagine housing as a social infrastructure, etc., can also help to come nearer to this kind of ideas. Imagining housing as a form of care. And one example was, I'm very much into teaching. We really went with our students into the social housing blocks in Vienna. We lived there, we teach there, we learned there from the people. And this is also a form how we can maybe begin imagining, teaching, practicing architecture or housing otherwise. We also went to Prague, I wanted to show that, and collaborated with the people there. When we want to imagine otherwise, I think it's also helpful to think of Audre Lorde. She says the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. And what she explains us with this is that they will allow us in individual cases to beat them at their own game, but they will never encourage us to bring about real change. So I think sometimes it's important to think or to imagine and go over the things that we are used to. I think we learned about very many normative ways how to practice, plan, build and perform architecture, how our bodies are in relation with objects in living spaces. There are many ways, also forms of media representation who teach us maybe how to, what housing is. The IKEA catalog is one of the most important literatures about housing. It's not printed anymore, but it was globally distributed everywhere. But also when it comes to toys, the dollhouse is also a form how we learned how housing is performed or lived. This is the updated version from today. We have thousands of TV shows like Marie Kondo, who tells us how to tie up our underwear. And I was investigating a lot how social media, or especially, this is the book I wrote about it, how especially these home and interior accounts of Instagram also shape our idea what the normative way of living or a home is. And these are not just things which are funny, but they surround us and we engage with them in some way. And as we can see in these very staged images, we can see that everything is done, everything is on the correct place, everybody is performing what it should perform, and in the end, many of these representations are connected to consumption, so in the end you can buy all these things, and a bit the idea behind this is if you have all these pillows and rugs and books and decor elements, then you have a better living. And I think it's in very opposition to that what I claimed for a better living for all in the beginning, that a better living cannot be reached with consumption because we do not have these living spaces like performed in this Texas house. So Instagram is not a neutral or public space, it's rather a standardizing system that produces certain forms of knowledges that we adapt as our housing knowledge. And living is, on these platforms, for example, introduced as an aesthetic consumption. Our homes maybe look more like this. Different works of different forms of labor are intervening there. We have to work, we have to meet each other. And these are more forms of lived realities. I would like to more or less end with this project. This is an intervention I've done with my colleague Max Utter. It's called Glitching Mies, and it's also the example to try to imagine otherwise. Can we create other images like the IKEA catalog or these accounts on Instagram showed us? And this was a temporal installation we did together with the Fundació Mies at the Barcelona pavilion. You all know this building very well, I'm sure. When I studied architecture, I met this building every week as a symbol of modernism, part of the architectural canon. It's very linked to the success story of Mies van der Rohe as well. Recent research also introduced more, also Lily Reich's work in that. And Max and I were questioning ourselves, is it possible to also have other imaginations about this space than just this linear story about this iconic building? We did this kind of irritations or interventions at the pavilion. We worked with other forms of materials, other colors, brought softness into that space. There's this statue, this naked exposed body of this female body, and we put these new arms and made a tentacular being out of it. We also tried to bring in symbols of domesticity, like this shower curtain, because even in the floor plans of the pavilion, something like a staircase is not shown because it's not representative. And I think it's very important to claim our bodies in these spaces because we have to take care of our bodies, so that's why we also thought about domesticity at this space. There was also the closet of embodied knowledge, and then we worked together with two performance artists. That's Chase. They are coming from ballroom culture from Barcelona, and this was during their performance, and it was really a snapshot where he was dancing with this empowered statue. This was Iver. He is also a dancer and performer from Barcelona. And it was very beautiful how they interacted with the existing building, with our architectural interventions and with their bodies. And in the end, these kind of images were created. And I think maybe, and that's why I put it into this presentation, these are also images which imagine another form, how this pavilion could be read, invaded by other bodies, by other forms of material, other colors, and also produce other images or narratives, what this space can offer. There's also a video, I think, which is much better to see bodies in action and see the space and hear the sound to it. I will close with this chapter. It's saying when we imagine housing otherwise, we also have to change our practices as architects. What does that mean, changing spatial practices? And I'm working a lot with the term of unlearning, which is not about forgetting or canceling. It's about questioning and adding, transforming existing forms of knowledge. And it's really also to choose another model, a different model. And when we look back to Vienna, it's still a growing city. This is Seestadt Aspern, one of the largest development projects in Europe. The question is a bit, in which direction should this new part of the city go? What does that mean for us as planner if we want to change our spatial practices? Do we want to go in this direction? This is an image of Christa Grimm. It's called the Mars House, and it was sold as an NFT for $500,000, which is the price of a single family house. That is also what we can do as architects, to sell our knowledge. Or do we want to aim for an luxury living, which we can do collectively. This is Alt Erla, erected in the 70s in Vienna. And normally when you see structures like that, you think that's a problematic area. But what Harry Glück did there, he added these pools on the rooftops. There are also indoor tools, club rooms, and a lot of maintaining of the building. So we can also decide that we can afford luxury if we do it collectively. Which length should the tables have that we are eating on? What could we share when we are living together? And where do we need individual spaces? Is it possible to put a bath tube in a living room? Which kind of living does that produce? How is it to live together with non-human actors? This is Sargfabrik in Wien, also a project from the 90s. And is it possible to live together with non-human actors? Is it possible to do care work collectively? This is a vacuum cleaner by Added Collective, where housework can just be performed collectively. You can't use it if it's just one person. And maybe this also changed our idea that we learned in some way that we have to do these things individual or give it to less privileged women. Can we do laundry together instead of watching TV together? And this is an image of Hannes Meyer, which shows, I think, very beautifully what a home maybe is. It's a space of where you can be, where you feel safe, where you can regenerate, where you can also, shown with the chair, maybe that it could be expanded to collectivity, which is also maybe a joyful space. And this was adapted by the collective air with a laptop and a smartphone, also to remind us that we have also kind of digital reality we're living in. So I think there are different approaches how we want to handle that. And this is my last slide. It's a book which will be released next week in Vienna, Changing Spatial Practices, Alliances, Activism and Network. And it's all about in which direction do we want to go. I hope there were some offerings in the lecture, or maybe there are other offerings in the book. And I think we should all keep on going what these changing spatial practices mean in connection with social housing. Thank you. And it was a bit too long, sorry.
It was completely fine. Thank you for your lecture. It was super interesting. So for me, I'm really happy that we have this possibility to extend a little bit also the curriculum of our university with these kind of lectures and discussion. And if you are interested, we have now time for a few questions. And yes, so feel free to ask something, Bernadette, in this special occasion. Don't be shy.
But it's also beautiful if everything was clear.
It's always a little bit difficult. So a lot of information in the lecture already, and yes, I don't have I mean, maybe the term of unlearning. We can speak a little bit about it. What does you already mentioned it a little bit? What does it mean for you in your academia or in your academic practice? But how does it work together with your students in your seminars? How is the discussion going with, in this term of unlearning?
I think it's a very popular term. I think you can see it in many lectures and books nowadays. And I think it's a term we borrowed from thinkers like Kadavi Spivak and many others. And I think it's for us, and us is me and Max Utterich, my colleague, and we're doing this collective praxis, Palace of Unlearning together. For us, it was a kind of opportunity to reflect on what is already here, and maybe also to say we want to make it differently. And for example, we did a design studio at our school, also with the same title, Palace of Unlearning, where we really questioned what do we learn, how do we learn, in which spaces do we learn, and also reflecting our role as teachers, but also asking what do the students want to learn. And I think we tried out very different formats, from camping or going into the blocks and living there, and finding out what these changing practices could be and what is important about. I think it's a term which gives a couple of chances to make architecture more diverse, more joyful, more solidary, integrate forms of empathy and solidarity. And for us, it was very helpful to work with this term. I mean, it's also very easy to write somewhere unlearning. It's quite fancy, and the exhibition as showed at the beginning in Berlin also had this title. But it's sometimes very hard also to practice it, because it also means to give up your privileges and also feel the loss to giving up these privileges. For example, as a teacher, it also means that you are that you're not perform the roles that you learn. And especially in the exhibition in Berlin, we see how hard it is also for an institution to practice unlearning. You know, when an exhibition is differently used, when visitors are part of the exhibition, when people are working in exhibition, when other topics are popping up. So I think it's really hard also to unlearn. It's a very fancy term, but doing it also requires a lot of power and a lot of strength also, and I think to do that collectively helps a lot too.
It was for me interesting, because we had like 2 years ago here Dubravka Sekulic, as I already told you, and she was also, especially in the interview she did after the lecture, speaking about the working clubs in a British context, and the discussion about what are the necessary or the really useful knowledge what we actually need. And it was also quite interesting, this historical reference with this topic.
Yeah. Hi, I'm André Hoida. I think the last part where you showed the work you participated in, or your own work, showed a lot of interesting things, and you rushed through it a little bit. Especially, maybe I would like to go back to the project with the Instagram, with the home furnishing. It sounded super interesting, but you went quite quickly through it. So if you could expound on it a bit, if you compared different accounts than those you showed on the slides, and what did you learn from it or find out?
Yeah, I thought I have to speak about Vienna a lot, and then you dive into this, I don't know, historic projects, which are really super stories you can explore. And I think for me it was also important to show that there have been also historically examples which tried out other ways, let's say it that way. And then I thought, okay, I think it's also important to talk about contemporary issues like facing social media, and that was my PhD. I could speak very long about it. I think in the end, I can wrap it up that it's important that also we as architects engage with popular media, or the media which surround us, and which is of course social media. So the access to visual material through our smartphones is tremendously, and we are surrounded by these images. And even if I showed very unpopular accounts in architecture, I think we can find in these home accounts an account from everybody in this room here. You can have shabby chic, you can have mid-century, you can have whatever you want. So the surfaces differ, I would say, but I think how housing is performed is very similar. It's always in these functional rooms of bedroom, kitchen, etc. Also how gender roles are performed are very traditional. And I think these kind of images surround us all the time, and they do something with us. And in this research, I had 4 ways where I said, okay, these are ways how these images changed our way we think, practice, or plan and build architecture. And one was that I think it's very connected to consumption, and it's a complete difference to housing as a human right. No? that it's more or less the narrative of all these very successful accounts. If you consume, you can have this perfect moment where your home is proper, where everything is done, where you can just take a coffee. And I think that's a bit of a lie, because many topics like in the Viennese part about affordability, safe rents, collectivity are left out. It's just about the surface. And also how collectivity is shown, I think, is very, it's this optimized individuums, and on the other hand, it's this kind of community, which is not really a tangible community you're part of. It's more an aesthetic and value community you're part of. And I think another very important thing is that we have very direct connections to a built reality. So when we look at another platform like Airbnb, you have apartments which are really built, which look exactly like these images I showed on Instagram. So you have this kind of air spaces you can find everywhere in the world, even if you're in Vienna, in Dubai, or wherever in Prague. These kind of brick walls, mid-century, white, etc. So we are moving between these air spaces, knowing that we will find the same IKEA furniture, etc., etc. And I don't want to say that this is bad, but this, our living environments get very standardized and very same. It's the kind of a sameness we are navigating in. And on the other hand, to this sameness, I think there's this kind of facade architecture, like the Wessel in New York or Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg, which are really buildings which are built for the visual representation, that you can make a good photo where the image really tries, or the building tries to connect to the rendering which was once here. So I think, these image worlds have connections to how we act as a society, but also how our built world is constructed. But I will leave it there, I think so.
Yeah, thank you.
For me, was also a really interesting moment in the lecture about the Red Vienna and the situation. And also maybe connecting to this Instagram kind of picture of the home, or this I would. So for me, it's also interesting the topic or the question of the aesthetics of the Red Vienna housing, because it was also connected to some kind of picture of home, maybe more in the urbanistic kind of situation, that this Hofe and this and the form of the house, which was connected to the city, and it was interesting to hear, and it's an important part of the problem that it's kind of both organized by the city, but it is organized also. It was also organized by the politician parties, or it was connected to the to this, and I don't know. It's not the question now. I'm a bit lost what I'm in the things what I'm speaking about, but. This social infrastructure and the lack of the social infrastructure in our Prague context is maybe also the part of the problem. It was also nice to also hear a bit kind of criticism or this critical point of view of this, how was this kind of infrastructure was built, and but at the end, also with this diagram in the beginning, with this 50% of the housing in Vienna is actually still maintained and owned by the city. We are in a bit difficult other situation, which is a bit complicated, this lack of the infrastructure. So
I mean, I think it's important to know that there is a kind of a bit of a heaven in this 50%, but there is another market in Vienna, which is the other 50% who is as everywhere. No? And even the 50% which is more or less regulated, or where the city can work with, I think we did a whole book about criticizing this part as well, because on the one hand, I think it's for me always important to show that there are states or cities which try out other models, and that there is this kind of very good infrastructure in Vienna, but I think there are also many problems in this infrastructure. So it's hardly impossible to do something there. We tried with our students did a workshop there, and it was hardly impossible, especially also for us as an institution, to find the right form, the right service administration to do something there. There are 1,000 rules what you are not allowed to do because it's a bit over-maintained in some way. I mean, maybe this sounds ridiculous, but it's very hard that people do not really identify where they are living. And it's very hard to participate where you live. No? And for example, also the question of racism. I mean, it's 15 years ago that Vienna opened this 50% for migrants. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Austria is like Switzerland or the Arabic Emirates, one of the states with the hardest points to access Austrian citizenship. So 30% of the people in Vienna are not allowed to vote. And they were also not allowed to access social housing. They opened this 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But still, there's this kind of Vienna First policy. You have to have a residence in Vienna for 2 years, that you're allowed to enter this stock of 50% apartments. So for people who, there are a lot of people in a very rich country, homeless people which are not part of the market, people which do not have passport, etc., which are left out. And I'm just asking myself, is this in such a rich country necessary? No? So I think this Ach Plus we did about Vienna is also trying to find how can we transform this kind of concept and bring it to a future and adapt it to especially also climate questions which are connected to migration, etc., etc. And I think there are many legs and many points of criticism. But yeah, it's always a bit explaining that there are moments of hope for a social infrastructure, but it's also very hard to keep it up and maintain it to current questions. So it's not just heaven.
It's always difficult to somehow to learn from the model of Vienna, because it's even impossible to think it in a short term. I would say so. It should be like a strategy or something. But yes, maybe this is also, it can be also invitation for the last lecture, because we will have a guest from Barcelona. It will be more about the current situation there in the city and how to organize ourselves as also architecture workers, but also as a cooperative which can like build the house for itself. But it's also connected to the policy and the politics of the city, and I hope it will be discussed the next week, and it will be also super interesting. So thank you for your lecture. If there is any other question, there is, so.
Sorry, actually, thank you for the talk, and thanks Mirek for his question. I wanted to ask something similar, and I think I'm not still satisfied about the critique of Vienna, and so I wondered if you could elaborate it a bit more. I mean, it looks like a paradise, or I know that there are some issues you couldn't still critique from inside, but I wonder if you see some like regression or some, because as I follow it kind of, it's somehow from distance seems that the development of Vienna somehow still goes forward, or there are other good projects which could be developed. But like I know that you have also, or I think you have a conservative government now. So whether there is a threat or already some policies which would actually take back some of those progressive politics which were won over the years. And then second simple question, was this pinky purple carpet reused?
Thank you for that question. So the first one, I mean, Austria is a very conservative, very right-wing country, but Vienna is really an exception. Vienna and all these models are, the Vienna model is possible because social democrats ruled the city over 100 years, and they have to do a coalition since 7 years, beginning with the Green Party and now with the Pinks. But they are still very the driving force. So housing was always their agenda. That's their political program. That's how they advertise their party. So I think Vienna is really an exception in Austria. There are no other cities in terms of size, but also in terms of the political dimension. I mean, also in Vienna, the right-wing party is growing. So the Social Democrats are not the Workers' Party anymore. That's like in every other country. I think the rights are picking them. But still, they have, I don't know, about 40% social democrats. So, and housing is their agenda. And I think that's why they never sold the stock, why they never give up the non-profit model, etc., etc. And I think that's really also why the model, in exception of, in comparison to the UK, survived in some way. Always when the Conservatives are entering a coalition, they bring up the topic of that there is the right to buy after a longer period, and there are still some apartments are sold. So I think the system is always under attack, and that's why I maybe took so much space to talk about it, because it's something we really have to fight about to have that. Yeah, so I think it's something you should know about, and we have to protect it to have this stock. And the other question regarding it's the fake purple fur. This is really, thank you for the question, because Max and I, we don't have, so we are both coming from academia, working at universities. We don't have an office, we don't have a budget, anything, but we have this fur. So that's something which is traveling with us from one project to the other. And this fur was firstly ordered by Rem Koolhaas for a Prada fashion show. And then it was bought by, it had really a material history. Then it was bought by Fosbury Architecture, which is an Italian studio. They made an exhibition at Magazine in Vienna, which is an exhibition space. We know the guys from Magazine sold it, brought it then to Barcelona. From Barcelona, it went now to Berlin. So it's traveling with us. It's really highly artificial. You can't bleach it. You can't do anything with it. It was really once a floor. It also doesn't get dirty. It's really undestroyable. I think it will can't never be recycled. So we have to use it all the time. We're a bit bored of it already. So we have a lot of packages of fake fur in Vienna. If someone is interested, we love to share it. But it has quite a material history, and also what you saw in the exhibition, on the one hand, it is connected to resources and budget, but we really managed that everything we used in the exhibition had a kind of a material history, and we spent all our money to a guy who did material research for us, and we said we need a mirror, and we paid him for collecting material and taking material back. We just bought the pink carpet, and this was used now for another exhibition in Berlin. So I think it's possible to work in some kind of circularity, even if it's very exhausting and needs a lot of time. Yeah.
So I would like to ask a question, because you mentioned that there is a push from the market to privatize the housing in Vienna. And I can imagine there was a boom in building, and now we have a building crisis. We are talking about that we are not building enough in Prague, I don't know, in Vienna. So do you have data if the market is catching up with the percentage of the cut of the market, which is private and which is municipal?
I don't know if I got it correctly, but
by sheer having the right to buy.
Yeah. So in Austria, the stock of the apartment, so you know that in Red Vienna, they bought really a lot of land. Like in the settlers movement, they bought this land, and then they also spent the money. Really 30% of all the housing blocks in Vienna were built with this housing tax. So it was an investment in land, and more or less, with some exception, this stock was never sold by the city. And I think it's really, it can't be allowed that proper land, public land is sold to private investors. I mean, that's done everywhere, you know, it belongs to all of us, more or less. And if you sell it to one investor, it's just increasing, it makes money for one person. So I think that shouldn't be allowed at all. And I think in comparison to the UK or also in Berlin, under the government of Wowereit, a lot of the social housing stock or public land was sold to private investors. So that means quick money, but then it was gone forever. And I think that's the difference between Vienna, that they in some way protected this land. I mean, still a city who is growing, there's not many empty plots anymore. I mean, Seestadt Aspern was a former airport. And it's really outside of Vienna, but there's the underground going there. But there are not many plots left, no? So we have to be very secure with the land we have. And normal non-profit associations, developers can't compete with the private market because the land is so expensive. So in Vienna, there are also certain rules that there is the Wiener Wohnfonds, for which is buying land where then non-profit investors can do social housing. But I think there are many organizations involved, and maybe that leads too far. But was this your question?
Well, my question was more like about the data that if you are collecting in your research or if you're in your...
The data for what?
Because you mentioned that there is a right to buy in these social housing estates.
Okay, that.
So
no, this was a wish from the conservatives. I mean, there are some apartments which were built after the war where you had the right after 10 years to buy it. And this was always a model which the conservatives wanted to offer, but there were very few flats which were bought. So this was really never really common, and it was not like in the UK the right to buy. They never sold really big amount of apartments, no. I mean, there's also the difference, Altbau, it's everything which was built before Second World War, has other regulation rents than after it, which is also a bit problematic, because why? So regulating rent is also a very an important topic, and there are also some things which could be improved.
Yeah, just one more question. From the other side of the paper, let's say, you've mentioned the imaginative architecture or something like that. I'm wondering, and if I get it right, you got one slide that shows like the workshop or something that was regarding the imaginative architecture. And I'm just wondering if the output was visual, or the whole process of imaginative architecture was done only in a visual way, or if you can just speak a few words about it.
I mean, I like a lot working with the word of imagining, and I think what we're doing in studios is imagining architecture. No? It's always trying out things and building models or doing drawings, what could be. No? And I think to take that seriously is super interesting, and I'm working very often with this term in workshops or in studio class. We tried to, is it possible to imagine the home otherwise through AI tools? Or is Midjourney just producing the crap of the internet and you can't imagine something different? We tried also with hand drawings and mixed techniques, model building. What can the term of imagining provide? But I think we can also imagine other forms of financing. So I think that's like the term of unlearning. Sometimes it's helpful to have these terms to start working. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one question about the one kitchen house, because I think like it's very interesting, but I was wondering like now if you would build something like that, I would suppose like people would kind of associate together kitchen as something that would be like dirty or difficult to maintain or something. And I was wondering like if there is, what would you consider the possibility to like, I don't know, either make people believe like that's the good solution, or like how to actually like I would wonder if there is a possibility to like maintain it correctly, or so that everybody would care about it and not just be like, I don't know, individualistic about their plots in particular.
I mean, the one kitchen house was very radical in the concept to put the kitchen out of an apartment. No? I mean, the kitchen was very connected to housework and to the female body, etc. So this was really a kind of a radical concept. But it was also a very, today you would maybe say this kind of serviced apartments in the platform economy in some way. Yeah? But I think what was so interesting is that in changing the arrangement of the building or the floor plans, also another social arrangement could emerge. No? And there was also a very great video, I couldn't show it today, but they made a kind of video to that the husbands are not too afraid of this kind of architecture. So it was more shown when in the Ein Kitchen building, the women, the wife has then more time for her husband, etc. I think there are some links to that they could organize there, or that could become feminist activists or however. These are my imaginations of the Ein Küchenhaus. I mean, there are many projects who are trying to contemporary projects who are trying to copy or to transform the idea of the one kitchen house. For example, there's in Vienna from Gabu Heindl the intersectional city house, which also tried, I mean, there's a kind of a kitchen infrastructure in each space, but it's a modern interpretation of the one kitchen house, and it's more addressing the terms of intersectionality. But for example, in Switzerland, in Basel, there's the Lena house, where they also put the term of collective food sharing as the main topic of the building into the spotlight. For example, when you enter the house, it's not mailboxes, you have this kind of restaurant mensa, and you have also a kind of collective fridge. It's a food cooperative. And then in the apartments, you just have a very, very simple water cooker and one plate for cooking. Yeah? So it's really that you meet all collectively in the basement and share things. And they also developed it further. For example, also bathing facilities can be shared. So they have rooms with 2 bathrooms where you can bath collectively, etc., etc. I think there are many interpretations, and every of these interpretation has legs. For example, the project in Switzerland, it's very expensive. I mean, it's really transforming the idea of what cooking is, but it's not affordable for everybody. And I think in every project you can find this kind of cracks or limitations, but you can also find these ideas that we could all have a collective fridge, which would be wonderful. And maybe, it's also just to reach out where ideas like the one kitchen house grew further, and there is a one kitchen house, I think, also in Stockholm and in Berlin. So it was an international model, and 2 of them were tried out in Vienna with their, potential and limitations. And the Projekt Rosa I showed, there the architect Sabine Pollack also asked, do you want to have a one kitchen house? And they said no, but what we do not need is a living room. So they have kitchens, but they do not have big living rooms, so they have these communal living spaces. For example, it's just a question, how could we maybe rethink or reimagine our floor plans or our habits of living? And one kitchen house is one example how architecture could change maybe social arrangements. No?
Okay, so thank you. And you are all invited for the next week for the final lecture by Lacole. And thank you, Bernadette, for your talk and your lecture. It was really interesting and inspiring.
Yeah, thank you to you.